April 28th, 1945. The war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The trucks rumbled to a stop outside the wire, engines coughing diesel smoke into air that tasted of spring rain and defeat. 27 German soldiers sat in the backs of those trucks, their uniforms still bearing the ghost of insignia hastily torn away, their faces carved hollow by hunger and the particular exhaustion that comes not from marching, but from surrender. They had walked for days before the Americans found them, a ragged column of men who had once believed they were invincible, now reduced to something between soldiers and refugees, belonging nowhere, wanted by no one. The youngest among them was Klaus Hoffmann, 23 years old, though the war had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. He had been conscripted at 19, bright-eyed and believing, fed on speeches about destiny and superiority, about enemies who were less than human. He had marched through Poland, through France, had stood guard in occupied villages where children watched him with eyes that held no childhood. He had done what he was told, because not doing so meant death, and because, in the beginning at least, he had believed the cause was just. Now he believed nothing, except that he was alive, and that this fact was either mercy or cruelty. He could not yet decide.
The camp appeared through the drizzle like a sketch gradually gaining detail. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers that looked almost decorative in their precision, chain-link fence that gleamed wetly, geometric and strangely clean. But what struck Klaus first, what made his chest tighten with a fear he could not name, was the absence of chaos. There were no screams, no barking dogs, no guards with whips, just American soldiers in pressed uniforms standing with a casual alertness that suggested boredom rather than rage. The truck's tailgates dropped with metallic clangs. The Germans climbed down slowly, joints stiff, boots squelching in mud that smelled of earth and metal, and the particular scent of places where too many men have gathered. Klaus kept his eyes down, waiting for the first blow, the first curse, the first confirmation that what he had been taught was true. It didn't come. Instead, a voice spoke in accented but comprehensible German. Form 2 lines, keep your hands visible. No one will harm you if you follow instructions. Klaus looked up. The speaker was an American sergeant, perhaps 30, with a weathered face and eyes that held neither cruelty nor kindness, just professional detachment. But beside him, a younger soldier, couldn't have been more than 20, was smiling. Not smirking, not mocking, just smiling. The way one might smile at a long line at the post office, mild and patient and utterly, incomprehensibly human. The smile landed in Klaus's chest like a stone in water, sending ripples of confusion through everything he thought he knew. They were marched through the gate, though marched was too strong a word for their shuffling procession, and into a processing area where American soldiers took their names, their ranks, their units. The questions were methodical, the tone businesslike. One soldier offered Klaus a cigarette while they waited. Klaus stared at the outstretched pack, "Lucky Strike," the label read, and felt his hands begin to shake. "Go ahead," the soldier said, his German clumsy but earnest. "It's just tobacco, not poison." Klaus took one with trembling fingers. The soldier lit it for him, the flame from his Zippo bright against the gray afternoon. Klaus inhaled, and the smoke was sweet and strong, American tobacco, tasting nothing like the harsh rations he had smoked in trenches. The soldier smiled again, that same inexplicable smile, and walked away, leaving Klaus standing there with a cigarette from the enemy, wondering if he had somehow died and this was purgatory, designed specifically to torment him with incomprehensible mercy. The barracks smelled of new wood and disinfectant. Cots lined the walls in military precision, each with a folded blanket, a pillow, a bar of soap wrapped in paper. Soap? Real soap? He held it to his nose and inhaled the clean, alkaline scent, and something in his throat threatened to break. He had not been truly clean in months. None of them had. They had lived in mud and blood and the stench of decay, had grown so accustomed to their own filth that they stopped noticing it except in the moments when they remembered being human. That night, as rain drummed against the roof, Klaus lay on his cot and listened to the camp settling into evening routine. Somewhere, a guard was whistling. The tune was unfamiliar, probably American, and it drifted through the darkness with an ease that felt obscene. How could anyone whistle after what the world had just endured? How could anyone smile?
The man on the cot beside him, Werner, a former corporal from Bavaria, whispered into the darkness, "They're softening us, making us weak before the interrogations begin." Klaus wanted to believe this. It would make sense. It would fit the narrative he'd been fed for years about American brutality disguised as civilization. But he couldn't shake the memory of that young soldier's smile, genuine and unrehearsed, offered to an enemy for no reason except perhaps that smiling was his nature. Morning came with a bell rather than shouting. The Germans rose stiffly, unsure of protocol, expecting punishment for hesitation. Instead, American soldiers gestured them toward the mess hall with the same patient indifference one might show to livestock. Not cruel, just practical. The building was warm, heated against the spring chill, and the smell that hit them as they entered made several men stop dead in their tracks. Coffee, real coffee, and bacon, and eggs, and bread that was white and soft and entirely free of sawdust or mold. Klaus stood in line, tin tray in hand, and watched as American cooks, soldiers in aprons, an image so absurd it felt like satire, ladled food onto the prisoners' plates. Not scraps, not punishment rations, actual meals, portioned as if they were people rather than defeated enemies. He carried his tray to a long table and sat among his fellow prisoners. For several minutes, no one ate. They simply stared at their plates with expressions ranging from disbelief to something close to rage. One man, Hans, who had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front, pushed his plate away and muttered, "Propaganda. They'll photograph us eating like pigs and show the world how Germany has fallen." But Klaus was too hungry to care about propaganda. He picked up his fork and ate. The eggs were hot and rich with butter. The bacon was crispy and salt-sweet. The coffee, when he sipped it, was strong enough to make his eyes water. Each bite felt like a small betrayal of everything he'd suffered, every meal he'd gone without, every friend who died with an empty stomach. Yet his body didn't care about loyalty or politics. His body wanted only to live. Around him, one by one, the others began to eat too. Some wept quietly while they chewed. Others ate with mechanical efficiency, as if the food would vanish. Klaus ate slowly, trying to understand the meaning of this meal, this impossible kindness from people he'd been taught to see as devils. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt increasingly surreal. Work details were assigned, helping to repair roads, sorting supplies, maintaining the camp, but the work was not brutal. Guards supervised, but they didn't beat or curse. They simply stood, rifles slung casually, sometimes sharing jokes among themselves that the Germans couldn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakably light. Once, Klaus saw an American soldier help a German prisoner lift a heavy beam, the two of them straining together in wordless cooperation before the American clapped the prisoner on the shoulder and walked away. That gesture, the casual touch, the acknowledgement of shared effort, stayed with Klaus for days. He had been trained to see Americans as subhuman, as racially inferior, as morally bankrupt mercenaries fighting for Jewish bankers. The propaganda had been relentless, vivid, designed to strip away any possibility of empathy. And he had believed it, or at least had not questioned it, because questioning meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the cause he'd fought for. But how could he maintain those beliefs when faced with this daily evidence to the contrary? These Americans, with their easy smiles and their competent orderliness, their abundance and their casual humanity, they didn't fit the narrative at all. They were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they were just men, tired and far from home, doing a job with neither sadism nor excessive sentiment. One afternoon, during a cigarette break, an American guard approached Klaus. The man was older, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his mouth. He offered Klaus a cigarette, this too had become routine, and lit his own before speaking in halting German. "You have family? Back in Germany?" Klaus hesitated, then nodded. "My mother, in Hamburg. I don't know if she's alive." The American exhaled smoke slowly. "Hope she is. War's hell on mothers." He said nothing more, just stood there smoking, looking out at the spring sky where clouds were breaking apart to reveal patches of blue. Klaus wanted to ask him questions. "Why are you kind to us? Don't you hate us for what we've done?" But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, they smoked in silence, and when the guard walked away, he smiled again. That inexplicable American smile. At night, the prisoners talked in whispers, trying to make sense of their captivity. Some clung to the old beliefs, insisting this was all theater, that the real punishment would come later. Others had begun to crack, admitting quietly that perhaps they had been lied to, that perhaps the enemy was not what they'd been told. Klaus listened, but said little. Inside him, a war was raging that had nothing to do with armies or territory. It was a war between what he had believed and what he was experiencing, between loyalty to a fallen cause and the undeniable evidence of his own senses. The truth was simple and terrible. The Americans were treating them better than their own officers often had, better than the Reich had treated its own people in those final desperate months. The Americans had food while Germany starved. They had order while Germany collapsed into chaos. They smiled while Germans wept. And this, Klaus realized, was the cruelest victory of all. Not to defeat Germany militarily, that had been accomplished, but to defeat the ideology itself by proving it false through simple daily kindness. Every meal, every cigarette, every casual smile was a refutation of everything the propaganda had promised. The Americans weren't subhuman. They weren't cruel. They weren't the villains in the story Klaus had been told, which meant he had been the villain. Or if not a villain, then at least a fool. A tool used by men who had lied to him, who had sent him to kill and die for a cause built on hatred and delusion. And now, in this camp, with its clean barracks and hot meals and smiling guards, he was being forced to confront what he had been part of. One Sunday, though Klaus only knew it was Sunday because the Americans seemed to treat it differently, more relaxed, a chaplain visited the camp. He was an American army priest, but he spoke to the German prisoners anyway, offering prayer in their own language, asking if anyone needed spiritual counsel. Several men went to him, and Klaus watched from a distance as the priest listened to their confessions with the same patient expression he'd seen on the guards' faces. What did one confess after a war like this? That you followed orders? That you believed lies? That you killed because you were told it was righteous, only to discover too late that righteousness had been propaganda all along? Klaus didn't approach the priest. He had no faith left to confess to. But he understood why others did. They needed someone to tell them they could be forgiven, that their humanity could be salvaged from the wreckage. They needed what the Americans were offering, not punishment, but the possibility of redemption. Weeks passed. Spring deepened into early summer. The prisoners grew healthier, their faces filling out, their eyes losing some of that haunted quality. They began to laugh occasionally, to play cards in the evenings, to teach each other English phrases they'd picked up. Klaus learned to say thank you, and good morning, and nice weather today. Simple words that felt strange in his mouth, but which the Americans always received with nods and smiles. Those smiles. He still couldn't fully understand them.
They weren't strategic or performative. They were just there, as natural as breathing, as if treating enemies with basic humanity was the default, rather than an exception requiring explanation. One evening, Klaus sat outside the barracks watching the sunset over the camp. The sky was brilliant with color, orange and pink and deep purple, and the air smelled of grass and distant rain. An American guard walked past, the same young soldier who'd smiled at Klaus that first day. He paused, following Klaus's gaze to the sunset.
Klaus understood enough to nod. The soldier smiled, of course he smiled, and continued his patrol. Beautiful. Yes, the world was still capable of beauty, even after everything they'd done to each other. Even after millions dead, cities destroyed, an entire continent in ruins. The sky didn't care about ideology or war. It just painted itself in colors that made the throat ache. Klaus thought about his mother in Hamburg, wondered if she was seeing the same sunset, wondered if she was alive at all. He thought about the villages he'd occupied, the faces of people he'd helped subjugate in the name of a greater Germany that now lay in ashes. He thought about his fellow soldiers, the ones who hadn't survived to see this camp with its impossible kindness. And he thought about the Americans, with their abundance and their efficiency and their maddening smiles. They had won the war, yes, but more than that, they had won the moral argument simply by being decent. Not perfect. Klaus wasn't naive enough to believe they were perfect, but decent, human, capable of treating their enemies as something other than vermin to be exterminated. This, he understood now, was what defeat truly meant. Not the loss of territory or military strength, but the collapse of the entire world view he'd been raised to accept. The Americans hadn't just beaten Germany, they'd proven Germany wrong about everything. As night fell and stars emerged one by one, Klaus made a decision. He would learn their language. He would listen to their ideas. He would try to understand how a nation could be powerful without being cruel, victorious without being savage. Not because he loved America. He didn't. Not yet. Maybe never. But because the alternative was to remain trapped in a dead ideology, to spend the rest of his life nursing grievances and hatreds that had already destroyed his homeland once. The young American guard passed by again on his return patrol. This time, Klaus stood and spoke in careful English. "Thank you." The guard looked surprised, then pleased. "You're welcome, buddy."
Buddy, friend. The word was almost offensive in its casualness, in its presumption that enemies could become something else. But Klaus nodded anyway, accepting the impossibility of it, letting it settle into his understanding of what the world could be. That night, he dreamed of home. Not the home he'd left, proud, uniformed, certain, but a home he'd never seen. A place where children grew up without learning to hate, where armies were unnecessary because conflicts could be resolved without bloodshed, where smiles were freely given because people saw each other as human first and enemies never. It was an impossible dream, naive, childish, but as he woke to another morning bell, another breakfast of eggs and coffee, another day of American guards smiling at their prisoners for no reason except that it was their nature to smile, Klaus allowed himself to believe that impossible things could become real. After all, he was living in one, a camp where enemies were fed instead of starved, where prisoners were treated with dignity instead of contempt, where smiles replaced snarls. If that could happen, perhaps anything could. The war of bullets and bombs had ended. The war of beliefs would continue for years, perhaps for the rest of his life. But Klaus Hoffmann, 23 years old and defeated in every way that mattered, had chosen his side in that new war. He would not be easy. Letting go of hate never was. Accepting that you'd been wrong about everything required a kind of courage different from battlefield bravery. But every morning, when the Americans smiled at him, Those inexplicable, genuine, maddeningly persistent smiles. Klaus felt himself inching toward a future where he might be able to smile back. And that, he thought, might be the truest victory of all. Not Germany's defeat, but his own painful, necessary transformation from a soldier of hatred into something approaching a human being again. The sun rose over the camp, gilding the barbed wire in gold. Klaus stood in line for breakfast, and when the American cook handed him his tray, Klaus met his eyes and smiled. It was small, uncertain, but it was real, and the American smiled back.